I am truly honored to be here today to speak to all of you. It's homecoming week, it's Founders Day. I was thinking actually on the drive-in this morning that I was offered the job of Provost this time last year during homecoming week. In fact, President Rowe called me during the homecoming basketball game that Saturday. I picked up the phone and he said, "Mike, this is David Rowe. I've got a very important question to ask you." And then in the background, I heard a buzzer go off, and he said, "Wait a minute, I got to go crown the king and queen of the homecoming court. I'll call you in a little bit." Hang up. We had a great talk that night, though. When David asked me to give the presentation today, one of the things he asked was, he said, "Now remember, it's Founders Day, so you must take a historical perspective." And I thought to myself, you know, I've only been here since July. So remember that Founders Day where it snowed? Sorry. Actually, today I want to make the case that it makes perfect sense for a newbie like me to be giving the Founders Day convocation address. I want to impress upon all of you here today, the faculty, the administration, guests from the community, the alums, but especially the students that are with us this morning, that we were influenced by the stories of our founders, that we're using those stories told to influence the stories we are living right now. And in the management of those stories lived, we are acting into a social reality that is Centenary College. We are making Centenary history right now. And in that way, we are all founders of Centenary. I'm a student of human communication. I have been my entire career. I take a decidedly social constructionist perspective to communication. I view communication not as something we do to somebody else, but as something that we engage in with each other to create the meanings that we use to make sense out of our lives. Communication is a messy process in which we actively construct meaning with each other in the moment. In The Masks of God, Joseph Campbell wrote, "The best things cannot be told. The second best are misunderstood. After that comes civilized conversation." And so he says, we come to the problem of communication, the opening, that is to say, of one's own truth and depth to the depth and truth of another, in such a way as to establish an authentic community of existence. So how does this community of existence happen? We are social beings. We are inextricably tied to one another. We coordinate our actions with each other, and we can't help it. We are constantly in a dance of coordination, and dancing is a really good analogy for this, because we coordinate with each other every day, but that doesn't necessarily mean we coordinate well. When our son Zachary got married, my wife Dinda and I, we danced at the reception. It wasn't pretty. It was coordinated, but you wouldn't really recognize it as any dance like on Dancing with the Stars. People took pity on us. They applauded when we were done, but we were still coordinating our activity with one another. Our coordination with each other is very complicated from my perspective, because not only in our communication with each other does it involve our interactions with each other, but it also necessarily involves all the folks in our past that we have symbolically connected with. That's an important point, this notion of who we're symbolically connected to. My father passed away 20 years ago. But don't think for a second that when in my interactions with other people, he doesn't still exert a powerful influence on me. An influence on what I think is important, an influence on what I think the problems of the world are, an influence on what I think the possible solutions might be. We are symbolically connected to our relationships with each other, but we're also symbolically connected to our group memberships, as is witnessed by the alums that are here today. by our community relationships, our regional identity, our culture. Each of those spheres of influence affects the manner in which we coordinate with each other. So I have this idea that we take our experiences and we symbolically represent them in a way that gives us an ability to escape the here and now. And isn't that what the historical record does for us? It allows us to gain a glimpse into something that has happened long ago. Julian Jaynes, in his book on the origin of consciousness, writes about the idea that self-reflexiveness isn't the same as thinking. That you can think fairly effectively and not be aware of what you're doing if you don't symbolically recognize it. This is the point that we all realize that time when we're driving, usually late at night down the interstate, and we've been driving for a while, and then it occurs to us that we can't remember anything that's happened to us in the last 10 or 15 minutes, yet we're driving the automobile. What songs were on the radio? What billboards did I pass? We have no clue. Marvin Minsky, the great artificial intelligence scholar, and his partner, Stephen Pepper, have written a lot about the notion that there's a difference between thinking and thinking about thinking. That the reality is different in the way that we process it. My grandmother, who I never met, and that's an important part of this story to illustrate my point. My grandmother, whom I never met when she was in her young 60s, suffered a stroke. And the stroke caused an anterograde amnesia, knocked out her short-term memory. And from that moment of her stroke on, she couldn't remember anything that happened to her. But she had perfect memory of everything that had happened up to the stroke. And so when my dad would go visit her, she would recognize my dad, and they would talk about the past. But what was really tragic in a way about her situation is that my grandfather was at the grocery store when she had her stroke. And so she was constantly wondering when he'd return from the grocery store. And so my dad would have these conversations with her, and they'd be talking about when my dad was a child, and she would interrupt this every couple of minutes and say, when's Grandpa getting back from Kroger? And for 7 years, she waited for my grandfather to return from Kroger. Not like, oh my gosh, it's been 7 years, where is he? But constantly on the verge of wondering when he would return. 3 years after her stroke, my grandfather died of a heart attack. She never knew. Just continued to wait for him to return. My grandmother, because she was not able to symbolically represent her world, it meant that she was unable to act mindfully into her current world. So these spheres of influence that we have are critical to us to help us make sense of what we're currently going through. Now, I want to digress for just 1 second and say something to the students that are here. And bear with me for just one moment. Last spring, on a dare, I shaved my beard for the first time in 33 years. Students at the Clinton School had asked me if they raised $5,000 for cancer research, would I shave my beard? This became kind of the goal. I thought that was kind of interesting, and so I said sure. And they raised the $5,000, and so I shaved my beard off. And it was really an unusual experience. It was one of those things, literally that day I was walking down the street, and I glimpsed my reflection in the store window, and I was like, who is that guy? But the weirdest thing was the next morning after I shaved my beard off, I woke up, I went into the bathroom, I turned on the light, I looked in the mirror, and my father was staring back at me. He didn't have a beard. For the first time really in my adult life, honestly, for the first time really in my adult life, I saw the physical resemblance that I have to my father. And I looked in the mirror, I looked at that reflection, and I thought, and I saw my brother Tom, which was kind of neat. Comforting too, in a way. And the more I looked, I saw other people, though. I saw Sister William Patrick, my 7th grade teacher who forced me to go to my first speech tournament. I saw Jerry Butler, my freshman speech professor at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, who invited me in to the profession of academics. He saw me and he knew that my nerd pack was constantly on high. And it's because of him that I do what I do. I hope each and every one of the students here, and all of you for that matter, has that experience. At some point, looking in the mirror and seeing back in that reflection the faces of people who have influenced you. If you do, I hope you take the time to thank those people for the influence that they've had on you. But here's the point I want to make to the students. Someday, maybe sooner than you think, someone, and maybe someone you don't even know, is going to look into the mirror one morning and they're going to see you. Because you will have had an influence on their lives in ways that right now you can't even imagine. And so embrace each moment of your life as a way of symbolically connecting to others in a way that will influence them to make sense out of the world in a positive and productive way. All right, so back to my point. These spheres of influences that we have generate a certain logical force, I believe, that guides our behavior. Rules of the dance, if you will, rules that help us define the particular dance we're doing and the ways in which we have to modify it to accommodate the reality that we're in. In Communication and the Human Condition, my very good friend Barnett Pierce describes our humanness as consisting of two interlocking narratives. Stories told that he says tame the terror of our lives and help us to know how to go on, what he calls coherency, history. And stories lived that help us coordinate with others through conjoint actions. It's in these stories told in our history that we gain coherence in our life, a comfortable constraint that guides us. Cicero wrote, "Not to know what has been transacted in former times is to always be a child. Not to tell the stories told is to always be a child. If no use is made of the labors of past ages, the world must remain always in the infancy of knowledge." Our own Dr. Lee Morgan has done such a wonderful job of cataloging the stories told of Centenary. In reading the history of Centenary, it's clear that the College of Louisiana, where we have our roots, was started because those within the brand new state of Louisiana saw the value in providing a liberal arts education to those who would be living into a dramatically changing world. Sound familiar? But we also use stories to coordinate our actions with other people. The words or actions that we use during a conversation come together to produce patterns that we call stories lived. If I had $1 for every time my mother said to me, "When you learn how to ask for it properly," I'd be a rich man. What she was really saying is when you learn how to follow the pattern of the stories that we tell as parents and children, what is adolescence if not the child's awkward violations of the patterns within the stories lived? When our son was growing up, he came to Dindon me one time and he said, "My good friend Matt's having a sleepover and he's invited me and they're going to watch an R-rated movie." Now he was, I can't remember how old he was, 11, 10, 11, 12, I don't know. "Is it okay if I go to the sleepover? They're going to watch an R-rated movie." Now, it says a lot about the stories lived, doesn't it, that he asked? And I'd said, gosh, Dinda went in, we were standing in the garage, and Dinda went into the house, and Zach and I were standing there, and I said, "Gosh, Zach, I don't know, an R-rated movie?" He said, "Yeah, it's no big deal. It's not really violence, it's not nudity, it's just words, just dirty words." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, no big deal." Now get this, he's a bright kid. "I've heard all the words before." He says, "I know the words they use in this movie. I've heard them all before. It's no big deal." Get the dance we're making now? So now it's my turn. So I looked at Zachary and I said, "So you know the words in the movie?" "Yes, sir." "No big deal." "No." So I'll tell you what. See, if you can go in the house and you can tell your mother all of the words that are in this movie, then you can go to the sleepover and watch the movie. He looked at me and he said, "Oh, darn." And that's what he said, which is also illustrative of the dance that we were. As a critical point in the conversation, I made a turn which changed the reality that he and I were going to live into. The stories we tell are fateful. They guide and they direct the way we think and feel and act. And again, my friend Barnett Pierce once wrote, "It's not too much to say that human beings are storytellers at once immersed in linguistic webs that they did not spin," stories told, "and busily weaving webs in which to immerse themselves and others, the stories we live." Now listen to this. Whether these webs are imprisoning snares or enabling scaffolds is, of course, a matter of opinion. My question is, how do we make the emboldening and enabling scaffolds? As we shift our focus to the stories told and stories lived in our lives, we can begin to see that there are certain points in which we can change the world that we live into, much like the example I shared with you about my son. We recognize at those points we can make something different of our world if we just choose a different turn. I guess any moment can be one of these bifurcation points. But some of these points seem to stand out more clearly to us than others. Trying to explain something technical to someone who doesn't have any foundational knowledge in the technology. Trying to interact meaningfully with someone whose cultural spheres of influence lead them to want to coordinate with you in a different way. But I want to share with you an example of a bifurcation point that I think illustrates well how we can take a different turn to create a different kind of social world. All those years that I lived in Little Rock, we lived about 10 miles from campus, and I would leave in the morning and I would have to get on the interstate and cross 3 lines of traffic very quickly, or else instead of going to downtown Little Rock, I was on my way to Fort Smith, Arkansas. And every morning I'd get on the interstate right about the start of rush hour. Traffic was just starting to build up, and I'd have to cross these 3 lanes and make the turn towards Little Rock. And normally on those mornings, you really do rely on the kindness of strangers. You engage in a stories lived that's a type of a dance where people slow down a little bit and they let you in and everything's okay. One morning I'm going to work and I'm in my car and I get in the first lane, no problem. I'm looking in the rearview mirror. I get in the second lane, no problem. And I look in my rearview mirror to get into the third lane, and coming down that third lane at a very high rate of speed is a car. And in that moment, and I know you've all been there, so you know what I'm talking about, in that moment I engage in that very complicated algorithm in my head. How fast is the car going? Do I have time to speed up and get ahead of it before I'm on my way to Fort Smith? If I slow down and let it pass, do I have time to still get over? I'm on my way to Fort Smith. What do I do? And so I decided to gun it a little bit, get in front. I thought there's plenty of time for this person to slow down. And so that's what I did. Got over, I thought, and looked in my rearview mirror, and this car is barreling down on me like there's no tomorrow. Right up on my bumper. And up ahead, around the turn, traffic is already starting to back up. We're going to be in rush hour traffic in just a moment. I'm thinking, what's the big deal? And I can feel my blood pressure starting to high. And it's a woman driving this car. Not that it's that important, but I think it's... It was the stories lived, okay? And she's honking her horn and shaking her fist, and it's just on you, and then suddenly just guns it and pulls out right into the 4th lane, coming up on the driver's side of my car, laying on the horn. And I'm driving, and I look over, and she is like this. Not really, this finger was not the one she was using, okay, but it was to that effect. And I was just like, now, I got to tell you that I've never, that's the only time in my life, I don't know what that means about me, it's the only time in my life I've ever had that happen to me. And so I didn't have anything really to pull from in terms of how to manage that particular experience. But I could feel my blood pressure rising, and I was thinking, I'm very internally process this stuff, and any other, I would have predicted that the rest of my day would have been ruined by that experience. There's no reason for that, is there? But in that moment, I took a different turn. In that bifurcation point, I told a different story to her. So I'm driving. And so when I looked at her, I went like this. And she went. and then gunned it straight ahead. And I thought, this is awesome. So we go up around the turn, and as luck would have it, we're now in rush hour traffic, and she's right next to me. We are right next to each other now in rush hour traffic. So for the next 5 minutes in rush hour traffic, I'm making little love taps on my horn, and waving, and she's just... And I know she was sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, I just flipped off somebody I know. Who is that guy? Yeah. So instead of ruining my day, it was like the best day ever. I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to get back to school. I got to the office. I said, oh, guess what? Someone flipped me off on the interstate. It was awesome. Stories lived. What's the story told? What I hope is, well, you just heard the story, so it's a story told already, but what I've always wanted to believe is that story lived became a story told for her, that it became part of the historical marker for her that she would use, and maybe from that point on, at least she would think a little bit before she would do that again. Maybe check really hard to make sure I don't know this person. Okay, and then let them have it. I made something different, and I want to assume that I sent some sort of rippling effect through all of the connected symbolic representations that she had. And like I told you the story of my grandmother, I often wonder if she tells people a story about a person that she doesn't know that maybe changed the way that she approached the world. Again, in Dr. Morgan's history of Centenary College, you read through this book, and what you see are those bifurcation points, where patterns of stories lived were changed in mindful ways, thus creating a shift in the stories told from that point on. The admission of the first African-American student, the hiring of the first female chaplain, the start of the first graduate program, all of these mindful turns in the centenary conversation. Last week at our faculty meeting, I shared with my colleagues my belief that Centenary is facing another opportunity for a turning point in its history. That our students, like those who first attended the College of Louisiana, are living into a dramatically changing world. And that to live effectively into that world, our students not only need frameworks of knowledge, but frameworks of action. And this leads me to the last point I want to make today. To me, it's all about communication. It's all about the stories we tell and how those stories then influence us in the way that we approach our work, our lives. But the thing we have to remember about communication is that it's irreversible. I say all the time to my students, and I've shared it with many of you in this room here, that the point to me about communication is not looking through to the outcome. And as I said last week, I do think a lot of us are guilty of wishing our lives away and not relishing the turns that we're taking right now and not relishing the time and the interactions that we have with each other, because we should be looking at those interactions because they're irreversible. My great Aunt Laura used to come and visit us when I was a kid, and she taught me a card game that today I believe was canasta. I can't remember. But the one thing I remembered, the one rule I remembered from her was a card laid is a card played. And she was a sweet, blessed saint of a woman, but she was fierce when it came to that rule. See a different side of her when we were playing canasta. Card laid is a card played, and that's really the rule of communication. I grew up Catholic. So when I was growing up as a kid, on Fridays, we would have one of two dinners in my house. We would have tomato soup and fish sticks, or we'd have tomato soup and grilled cheese. And I got to tell you, for the longest time, I thought there was some religious significance to the tomato soup. Was this left out of the story somewhere? And it's always tomato soup. But at my house, and I got to let you know, my mother knows I tell this story. At my house, you would know what particular dinner we were having that evening because of a very distinctive sound coming out of the kitchen. It would sound like this. And that would be the sound of my mother with a knife in one hand and a burnt grilled cheese sandwich in the other. Scraping the burnt stuff off of the sandwich into the sink. Now, if you've ever done this, which I'm sure you have, then you know what that's like. You scrape it off, and you can't even rinse it down the sink. It's just, So here's what we learned in my family. Now, my mother would only burn one side of the sandwich. So she'd scrape them off, she'd flip them over onto the platter, they'd look perfect, and she'd bring them out to the table. But here's what we learned in my family. You bite into a grilled cheese sandwich that's been burnt. I don't care if you scrape it down to the cheese. When you bite into it, you know it's been burnt, okay? It's like you wake up the next morning and you think to yourself, man, that sandwich last night was burnt. I mean, you cannot unburn a burnt grilled cheese sandwich. Okay? It's just impossible. Probably some Zen saying that's related to that. And communication operates the exact same way. These bifurcation points, these dances that we do, these stories that we tell are critical to us. And the reason why we look so carefully at them in the moment and don't lose sight of them in terms of looking through them is because they're irreversible. And we should take advantage of those moments. And so we ask ourselves the question today on Founders Day, what are we making here? Guided by our stories told and acting into our world with the stories lived, what are we making here? But maybe today it's more appropriate to ask ourselves on Founders Day, we should reframe that question. What are we finding here? Because in the choices we make, the stories we live together as a community of students and faculty and administration and alums and community will be added to the stories told that will give meaning to what Centenary College is from this point forward. I have only been here since July, but I am a Centenary founder. We are all Centenary founders because all of us are contributing to what's being made here. All of us are contributing to building enabling scaffolds. And I believe we will find a Centenary that is stronger and more viable than ever. That's what I want our stories told to be. Thank you.